summer, my inbox fills with sunscreen scares. As a cosmetic safety toxicologist, I have to fact check them. Hey everyone, my name is Mo, and if you are new here, I am a toxicologist and cosmetic safety assessor. My job includes verifying when products are safe to use and allowed to be sold on the market. Today's video is about going over the statement of toxicologist Dr. Yvonne Burkart in her latest video here on YouTube titled Toxicologist Reveals 6 Things You Should Know About Sunscreens. She promises shocking reveals. Let's see if they are actually science or just the spooky season coming early. Another thing is that this video is a tag team with the one and only Dr. Wong, aka Lab Muffin Beauty Science. Michelle tackles half the claims on her channel, so I really advise you to watch the second part on her channel. I am handling the rest here. Bonus, we run both our script past 2 independent PhD toxicologists, so you are getting peer review level fact checking, not just hot takes. So let's begin. A quick geography lesson so the rule book makes sense. I am based in Europe. Dr. Yvonne is in the US. Over here, sunscreens are considered cosmetics, the same bucket as moisturizers and lipsticks. While in the US, it is considered an OTC drug, over-the-counter drug, parked next to the cough syrup on the regulatory shelf. You might ask me, Mo, why are you talking about this? Because in the US, the sunscreen formula must fit into the FDA's OTC monograph and administrative orders. Think of those monographs as recipes. Every ingredient, including UV filter and yes, fragrance, this point is important for you to remember later, goes through the FDA paperwork, which means safety is taken very seriously. In the EU, on the other hand, we have multiple layers of safety. Manufacturers need to provide safety dossier to approve a new UV filter. For example, regulatory bodies like the SCCS and European Commission have to analyze those applications. Then we have for each product an independent safety assessor, that's me for example, going after the sunscreen formula before it can be launched to the market. So yes, the FDA hold the leash a bit tighter on the formulas of sunscreen because they are regulated as drugs, while the EU allows the use of more advanced filter. For example, we have 29 UV filter here compared to 16 in the US. I know regulatory talk can be boring, but this regulatory introduction is much needed and there is a small part to be discussed as well. In Europe, the safety of cosmetic ingredients is settled by a three-way dance. First, we have the European Commission hands the question to its Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety, the SCCS. This committee has 9 core members, funded by the Commission, not by companies, scrutinize every toxicological study the industry is legally obligated to submit. On tricky dossier, the SCCS hire external expert and reviewers. Then we have the draft opinion for public comments. Only when all those voices converge together to give us a margin of safety dose, then Brussels give the nod for a yes or a no. As you can see here, the butyl paraben opinion that people love to cherry pick, it involved 20 scientists, a dozen of papers, and 14 exposure endpoint before the ink dried. To give you an example of what's happening in those meetings, I once sat in on a pesticide risk meeting. Half of the panel wanted a triple safety factors. The other half thought the data already overshot. The final verdict was a negotiated middle ground because regulation isn't a TED Talk, to be honest. It's a consensus building. So when a single YouTube toxicologist waves an outlier studies and tell you have to avoid X, Y, and Z, this isn't regulatory science, it's personal branding. Now let's jump across the Atlantic. Sunscreens are OTC drugs as we established, but cosmetics overall get a lighter FDA touch. Even so, the Cosmetic Ingredient Review, the CIR panel, is still issuing peer-reviewed assessment, and the new MOCRA law forces every brand to keep a safety file on hand. If a product causes harm, the FD&C Act lets you sue the brands immediately without the FDA intervention. So after this introduction about regulation, whether it's Brussels or Washington, D.C., It takes a village and a cabinet full of studies to call an ingredient safe. One influencer does not make a regulation or what regulation is supposed to be. Let's start with sunscreen getting into your blood. Here Dr. Burkart says,
this study mentioned that all 6 of the tested active ingredients that were administered in 4 different sunscreen formulations were systemically absorbed and had plasma concentrations that, quote, surpassed the FDA threshold for potentially waiving some of the additional safety studies for sunscreens.
Cast your mind back to May 2020 when every newsfeed wrote sunscreen chemicals detected in blood. The headline came from an FDA max use study. Remember, in the US, sunscreens are considered as an OTC drug, so the FDA runs the show. Volunteers in the FDA trial coated 75% of their skin 4 times a day at a textbook dose of 2 mg per centimeter square for 4 straight days. After that marathon slather fest, 6 UV filters showed up in the plasma above 0.5 nanogram per milliliter, a value called by authors a threshold. Here is the line most articles trimmed away, and I quote, "These findings do not indicate that individuals should refrain from the use of sunscreen," end of quote. And you might ask me, Mo, why did they write this? Because 0.5 nanogram per milliliter isn't a danger limit. It's the FDA paperwork trigger. We call it the threshold of toxicological concern, TTC. Think of TTC as a traffic light for the unknowns. Stay below it and regulator assume the dose is too low to matter, cross it, and you simply have to provide extra toxicological studies like carcinogenicity, reproductive studies, etc. In other words, the trial tripped over a bureaucratic speed bump, not a health alarm. So did we stop here? Unfortunately, no. Critics shouted endocrine disruption. So a 2023 study in toxicological science did the next logical step. Researchers pulled more than 200 endocrine assays per chemical from the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, ToxCast and Tox21 database, and compared the weakest in vitro effect level with those FDA's blood peaks. For the UV filters, octisalate, homosalate, octocrylene, octinoxate, and avobenzone, the lab effect dose was 1 to 1100 times higher than anything actually circulated in the volunteers. Even oxybenzone, the outlier, would need a 4-fold jump before a faint estrogenic signals appeared. And because it's an in vitro study, there is a funny part, which means most hits or positive result in those assay or hormonal assays came from the cells when they were already dying, and that can be, with a good chunk of confidence, translated as plain cytotoxic noise, which means cells are literally dying, so they are going into chaos, not hormonal hijacking by the UV filters. Before everyone jumps and say why cells are dying, the answer is simple. In vitro studies, the cells usually are sensitive to the slightest change. If you accidentally added plain water to the cells instead of their favorite nutritious food soup, they will wave a white flag at you and dies immediately. And we know water is essential for us, so most in vitro studies need to be taken with a grain of salt if we want to translate the result to a full functioning system like a human body. So although this study found very safe margins for endocrine disruption, that cells were dying at those concentrations before we saw some effect that were most likely caused by cell actually dying. And as a cherry on top, the author summed up their finding neatly, and I quote, "These organic UV filters have low intrinsic biological activity and low risk for endocrine disruption in humans," and I end my quote. The translation for the rest of us means that the blood level scare was actually an administrative footnote, not a reason to ditch your SPF unless you plan to use 4 bottles of sunscreen every long weekend, in which case your wallet will quit before your hormones do. Dr. Burkart decided to go after fragrance. If I hear one more horror story about fragrance, I'm showing up to Halloween dressed as giant lilial molecule. First thing first, how fragrance safety actually works. Internationally, two bodies police the perfume industry or the perfume world. RIFM, which does the science, and EFRA, which turns that science into rules. RIFM runs a huge toxicology program and publish a safety file for every single aroma, molecule, or chemical. Open access, but be warned if you want to read those, it reads like an OECD report, so bring coffee. EFRA then issues a standard that say, for example, linalool max is 0.3% in leave-on skin product or lilial 0% anywhere. If a fragrance house follows EFRA and all the major houses do, the cosmetic brand buying that fragrance from that house automatically is in line with the global safety limits. Let's talk about claims check. In the EU, fragrance-free means exactly that. No ingredient with a perfuming function, full stop. Try sneaking in a masking scent and you are in a breach of the 2017 EU claims regulation guidance. In the US, the FDA handles it under truthful and non-misleading labeling. Their own why product, for example, Q&A page spells it out as if you say fragrance-free, you cannot add fragrance ingredient. Brands that cheat don't face regulators so much as class action lawyers. And those guys, trust me, bill by the hour, and ask any company or beauty brand that settled over mislabeled deodorant. Dr. Burkart seems to be mixing up unscented, smell masked, with fragrance-free, no perfuming ingredient. And that is why industry-specific expertise is essential. Just being a toxicologist with a title is not enough to understand the ins and outs of the industry. Now jumping to the Lilial soap opera. Lilial was never banned because of a new risk assessment. It was a collateral damage from hazard classification. Again, let's start with a quick regulatory explanation here on the differences between hazard and risk, because online a lot of people use them interchangeably. Hazard describes the intrinsic properties of a substance or a chemical. Like, let's take water for example. We know it is very safe substance, we need it actually to survive, but from a hazard standpoint, if we got a document called SDS, safety datasheet, that focus on the hazard of water, it can say things like can cause lung damage if inhaled, it can cause burn when heated, and extreme lung exposure can disrupt skin protective layers, which are all true in reality, but the risk of those things happening is very low because we are exposed to water in a correct way, and that's what happened to Lilial. Every substance has a dark side and can cause us harm, even water and oxygen, but how are we exposed to it matter the most, and how much. And here where risk comes to play. When we do risk assessment for a chemical, we calculate how much we are exposed to a certain chemical, and for how long, and how are we exposed to it. In 2020, the EU CLP system labeled Lilial as reprotoxic 1B, a presumed human reproductive toxicant, and based on high-dose rat studies. Under EU Cosmetic Article 15, any CMR classification for cosmetic ingredients is banned automatically, no exposure calculation allowed unless the industry coughs up an exemption dossier, which in reality they didn't. End of story, Lilial was banned. Then fragrance suppliers shrugged and reformulated worldwide because EFRA already had tight caps on Lilial, and there are plenty of substitutes. But what about the US? We explained the Lilial situation in the EU. Fragrance houses sell the same reformulated bases on both sides of the Atlantic. EFRA's Amendment 49 of 2022 set lilial to 0, so you would have to work hard to find it in an American cosmetics today. Different legal routes, same practical outcome. Products are safe on the both sides of the Atlantic. But what about fragrance skin sensitization or endocrine disruption? In the EU and recently in the USA, the listing of potential allergen is required on the label when a certain concentration is exceeded, and that is 0.001 in leave-on products and 0.01 in wash-off, and that include limonene and citral. This regulation was implemented to protect consumers who are already sensitized to those compounds. So if you have a healthy skin with no previous negative reaction, you can keep using your fragrance product. But what about endocrine disruption? EFRA and REFEM both use and advocate endocrine assessment for the fragrance chemical. For example, in the lilial case, repeated dose toxicity and developmental and reproductive toxicity was used to assess the safety, and also EFRA position paper on endocrine disruptors in 2014 state that fragrance material must be assessed for endocrine potential using weight of evidence, potency, and exposure-based approaches, and reject hazard-only listing. In simpler words, if I have a molecule for a fragrance and use the hazard approach, which means from earlier hazard versus risk explanation, list down the intrinsic properties of this chemical, what it can potentially do, and to rely only on this for safety, then we will have zero fragrance molecule left. And we need to ban water as well because it can cause lung damage if inhaled. On the other hand, the effort-heavy approach of exposure, risk assessment, and weight of evidence can help us understand what can be used safely and allow us to set safety limit. Hazard don't take exposure, doses, or duration into account. It simply say if you inhale water, it can cause damage, but how much water, and we need water to survive. It ignore all of those details and provide simple yet less nuanced way to classify chemicals. So as you can see here on REFEM website, the endpoint for assessing fragrance molecule cover reproductive toxicity. Dr. Burkart included a study when she was talking about fragrance, and the study itself only measured diethyl phthalate, methyl and propylparaben, triclosan, and benzophenone 3. So the study enrolled 100 Latina teens from California, collected a spotted urine sample, switched those girls for 3 days to off-the-shelf product labeled as phthalate, paraben, triclosan, and benzophenone 3 free, then took a second urine sample. From the design, we can pick many weaknesses, to be honest with you. Small, convenient sample size, one ethnic group that cannot be generalized to the wider US population, no control arm, no randomization, only a 72 hours window, long enough for fast clearing chemical to fall, but far too short to learn anything about health effects. Key results from this study is median urinary DEP or diethyl phthalate dropped 27%, parabens dropped 44%, triclosan 36%, and benzophenone 3 36% after 3 days. But urinary level were already tiny. And to give you an example for baseline, DEP metabolite AP was 66 microgram per liter, assuming we urinate 1.5 liters a day. That means 0.5 milligram a day, compared to the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency of the US reference dose of 0.8 milligram per kilogram a day, which translates to 56 milligram for a 70 kilogram adult. Give us a clearer picture. Even before the clean swap, let's say, exposure was 500 times lower than the chronic safety limit. Did the study assess any health outcome? The answer is nope. So the paper only shows that short-lived chemicals disappear quickly when you stop using them, something already know from pharmacokinetics. It does not show that baseline level were harmful, nor the 3 days drop improved health outcome. And last fun thing about this study is that urinary ethyl and butylparaben actually increased in some girls, even though the replacement product were paraben-free, which in my opinion is the most interesting finding by the study itself, that substitution bias free from products can swap one member of a chemical family for another that wasn't monitored. The study itself cautioned about this in its conclusion. So let's retire the hidden perfume menace narrative between REFIM data, EFRA limit, EU claims rules, FDA truth in labeling, and a pack of hungry litigators. Fragrance safety is one of the most aggressively managed part of the cosmetic toolbox. No Halloween costume is required. Now aerosol sunscreen, Dr. Burkart says,
Number 4 thing I wish I knew is that aerosol sunscreens are a breathing hazard. So spray sunscreens come with a hidden risk.
Let's start with the fact that I'm not a fan of sunscreen aerosol sprays, not because of safety concern, but in reality because they suck at providing adequate protection. And my friend from Lab Muffin Beauty Science, Dr. Michelle Wong, did an amazing video about them to estimate the true protection they provide. And my final verdict is that I don't recommend them. First, understanding how aerosol work is really important to understand its safety. Press the nozzle and a little physics shows begin. The propellant gas blasts out first, dragging the sunscreen formula with it through a pin-sized orifice, leading to a shredding of this formula into droplets of every shape and size. Most are big wet blobs that dive straight onto your skin or on the floor. A smaller size, think of a grain size or the pollen size, float briefly in front of your face, but it's still too chunky to slip down your windpipe or the respiratory system. The only droplets we are actually worried about is the ultra fine one, under about 10 micrometer. Those are light enough to ride your breath deep into your lungs. That's why before a spray sunscreen actually hit the market, safety assessors like me demand a droplet size profile from the aerosol suppliers. Rule of thumb, no more than 5% of the total spray may stay airborne, and even a tinier fraction, ideally less than 0.1%, should fall below the 5 micrometer respirable cutoff. We also check how those droplets evolve. Do they clump up together into harmless bigger drops or dry down into dust that could sneak further into your airway? Once we have the numbers, we plug them into exposure model. Think of those exposure model as a fancy spreadsheet married to indoor air physics to test real-world scenarios, whether it's a single burst in a ventilated bathroom or 3 kids on a windy beach, you name it, we have it. Then we slap conservative safety factors on top for weaker population like children, pregnant women, and asthma patients. If the model says that the margin of safety is anything under 100, the formula goes back to R&D. Consumer never sees it on the shelf. That's the unseen layer of math and measurement standing between your lungs and every can you see on the pharmacy or the drugstore shelf. And then Dr. Burkart says this:
if it were a spray or aerosolized product that you are inhaling into your lungs, because what you inhale can quickly enter your bloodstream and your brain depending on the type of chemical that it is. And again, we need to protect our airways at all costs.
I don't know what happened to the blood-brain barrier, but yeah, getting it into your blood that fast is not a risk because it will not reach your lungs in high enough doses, as I explained earlier regarding the droplet size, where the droplets are not small enough. Now let's talk about propellant gas. Dr. Burkart decided to say that you can find butane and propane, which are propellant gases, in the blood after getting exposed, and that is true because those are gases and you can inhale them. But based on the study she provided of death cases by butane and propane, inhalation abusers' levels of butane and in their blood were around, and please remember those numbers, 25.5 to 54.3 microgram per milliliter. And in a study I found volunteers sprayed aerosol hair product inside a chamber and they sat for up 8 hours in a concentration of 250 to 500 ppm, and the test atmosphere already higher than any typical bathroom use. At the end of the exposure, the blood level was analyzed and were only 0.04 to 0.09 microgram per milliliter. That is all make us understand that butane and propane are rapidly exhausted from our bodies at a cosmetic use level. Peak blood concentration comparing the two studies were 1,000 times lower than the level that triggered arrhythmias in the abuse case report. Those fatal cases involved deliberately, because it's an abuse use, inhalation of lighters refill that contain concentration of 50,000 ppm, not a single digit ppm for 1 second peak recorded in a consumer study. And the last point is for the spray of non-organic filter like zinc and titanium. The SSES compared the highest measured release of 1.5 multiplied by 10 to the power of 6 particle per application with a conservative nano-reference value for workers, which means occupational level exposure, of 4 multiplied by 10 to the power of 4 particle of centimeter cubic for 8-hour time weighted average. And they found when they compare two numbers, there is more than 100,000 fold safety margin. And they took it a step further and they calculated the lifetime cancer risk based on modeling using rat data, give us a number that is lower than 0.00001%, which means in reality, in spoken words, little to no concern. Now let's jump into the US. The story is a bit different and more strict in my opinion. There are ongoing proposals to set limit droplet size to reduce the risk of inhalation, like proposed administrative order OTC 00008 of 24 September 2021. The current CARES Act of March of 2020 set a general but effective rules about the safety of sunscreen in a specific dosage form of aerosol spray, which read that the manufacturer need to make sure OTC product does not cause harm to the consumer and conduct inhalation studies. So as a final word for spray sunscreen, they suck at protecting you. Some of them smells really bad, but they are assessed for safety and yes, inhalation included. So please keep using what you are using and never listen to people who base their life on fear and use of nuggets of truth covered with loads of misinformation to make you buy the perfect solution from them. If you are super worried and still like to use a spray sunscreen, just spray it on your hand and rub it in. That solves two concerns if you are overly concerned about those things. You apply the sunscreen better for superior protection because you rub it in and distribute it correctly, and also reduce the risk of inhalation. To be honest, I think we underestimate how much fear shapes the way we make choices, especially about our health. Before I earned my title as a toxicologist and a cosmetic safety assessor, I was a pharmacist. I worked in a community pharmacy back home in Syria, and while the culture is different, the fear-driven misinformation was exactly the same. I will give you an example. I remember a heartbreaking encounter with a patient whose family had decided to stop chemotherapy for their parents' cancer. They had seen a viral video going around by a well-known charlatan claiming that cancer is simply a deficiency of vitamin B12, a so-called vitamin that is not only unproven but actually dangerous. B12 is not a real vitamin, it breaks down into cyanide inside the body. They came into the pharmacy asking for it, hoping it helped, desperate and scared. I did everything I could to explain the risk. But they truly believed that what they saw online. They weren't being foolish, they were just afraid and they wanted to save someone they loved. I don't know why Dr. Yvonne chosen this path. Maybe in my opinion it's for a financial gain or to promote her courses, or maybe she genuinely believed this is helping. Maybe she had personal results and attributed them to the product swaps and lifestyle changes. That's not impossible. Our brains are highly susceptible to the placebo effect, but whatever the reason, the way she is spreading this information with authority of a PhD and the superficial credibility of cherry-picked data is, in my opinion, deeply irresponsible. Many of the studies she cites are outliers, weak, irrelevant, or misrepresented. When fear is dressed up as science, it becomes harder for people to tell the difference. And this kind of misinformation has a snowball effect. You start with fear about cosmetics, and before you know it, you've changed your whole lifestyle in ways that may actually put you at risk. I know that might sound dramatic, but biology is complex far more than most people realize. In real science, experts are often the first to admit we are still learning about it. That is the honest answer, not because we are hiding the truth, but because science moves forward carefully based on what the data can actually support. Contrast that with someone who tells you they have cracked the code or the hidden code, that you just need to change your shampoo and all your health problem will magically disappear. I really wish it worked that way. I really wish, in a way, changing your toothpaste could cure your Parkinson's. I wish quitting your sunscreen would solve your hormonal issues, but reality isn't that simple. I'm not here to scare you. I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm here to explain what the vast majority of scientists and experts agree on. This isn't about my personal opinion or a new discovery. I just try to make complex science easier to understand, so fear doesn't have to take over your decision making. So please be curious, be critical, ask questions. Don't let fear and slick marketing lead you down a path of false hope. And as always, stay safe, stay grounded, and I see you in the next one. Bye.